Hello, sleepy traveler, and welcome to this quiet corner of the past. Tonight, we're going to take a slow, shadowy walk through a moment in history, a moment wrapped in mystery, silence, and change. Before we begin, I just want to say, I'm truly glad you're here. Whether you're winding down for the night, already tucked under a blanket, or simply looking for a peaceful place to let your mind drift, you've found the right place. If you'd like to, feel free to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It always amazes me how far this quiet little circle of history lovers has grown. And if you enjoy these slow, sleepy journeys through the past, don't forget to subscribe. It helps more than you might think. But for now, let everything else slip away. Breathe in and breathe out. Let your shoulders relax. Close your eyes if they're ready. And picture yourself somewhere far from here. A stone hall lit by flickering firelight. Cold stone beneath your feet. The scent of wood smoke curling gently in the air. And a story waiting to be told. The year is 1346. Europe is peaceful. On the surface, the land is quiet, full of routine, the rhythm of prayer, harvest, and sleep. In distant fields, the grain is high and golden. Villagers walk barefoot along dirt paths, the scent of earth and bread in the air. Candles flicker in stone churches. The world turns slowly. In the east, beyond the mountains and rivers, lies the Great Silk Road, a winding trail that carries not just silks and spices, but languages, laughter, and stories from faraway lands. Caravans creak across the deserts of Asia. Ships glide across the Black Sea, from China to Persia, to the bustling port of Kaffa on the Crimean coast. And there, a storm is quietly forming. In the city of Kaffa, by the water's edge, the air is tense. The city is surrounded. An army of Mongol warriors has come to claim it. They wait outside the walls, thousands of them, campfires glowing like stars on the hills. Inside the city, the people prepare for a long siege. They stack grain, gather water, and pray beneath the bells. But something strange begins to happen. The soldiers outside start dying, not from wounds, but from something far worse. Their bodies swell with blackened lumps, hot to the touch, foul-smelling. Their mouths fill with blood. Their skin turns dark. Within days, even the strongest men fall. Fear spreads faster than arrows. And then, in a moment of grim desperation, the Mongols do the unthinkable. They load the rotting bodies of their dead onto catapults and hurl them over the city walls. The people inside scream. Priests raise their hands to the sky. Mothers gather their children and hide in the corners of stone homes. But the sickness has already taken root. Soon after, the gates of Kaffa open. Italian merchants flee, slipping onto ships and sailing west, toward Sicily, Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. They carry bolts of silk, sacks of saffron, letters from distant lands. But hidden in the shadows of the ship are rats. Black rats with twitching noses, sharp claws, and fleas clinging tightly to their skin. The fleas carry something invisible, something that will spread from blood to blood, village to village, and soul to soul. The ships cut across the sea like knives, and behind them they leave a trail not of foam, but silence. It begins slowly. In the port of Messina, a sailor collapses at the docks. His neck is swollen. His lips are dark. He can hardly breathe. By evening, 2 more have joined him. By morning, 10. Soon, 1,000. The bells ring, not for worship, but for warning. In Venice, people begin locking their doors. In Paris, wagons collect the dead. In London, the The first whispers of plague begin to stir in the cold air, but no one truly knows what it is. Some call it a curse. Others say it's punishment from the heavens. Many blame the stars, or strangers, or even the wind. They do not yet know the truth, that the enemy is too small to see, but too fast to stop. Imagine, dear listener, you walk through a village on a late autumn morning. The sky is gray, the trees bare. The smell of wood smoke clings to the air. But something is wrong. Doors hang open, windows are shuttered. And from somewhere far off, a bell rings. Slowly. Dong, dong, dong. No one is in the fields. No one walks the roads. You hear a child crying. Then silence. Even the birds have gone quiet. This is no longer the world you knew. It is something else now. A world under a shadow. Let your breath grow softer now. Let your body sink deeper into stillness. As we move forward into the story, in the next part, we'll travel deeper into the heart of Europe, to the cities, the villages, and the voices of those who lived through the darkest nights. Some wrote their thoughts in journals. Some sang prayers to the stars. Some said nothing at all. But their stories remain, soft echoes in the silence of time. You are still here, sleepy traveler, safe beneath your blanket, eyes gently closing, the soft rhythm of your breath like the tide of a quiet sea. In this next part of our journey, we drift deeper into the past, into a Europe beginning to tremble, where each town, each street, each church bell and flickering candle stands at the edge of something it cannot understand. Let the fire crackle beside you now. Let the stone walls of history surround you. And listen as the shadow grows. It spreads quietly at first, not with screams, but with silence. In Messina, Sicily, dock workers fall ill before their cargo is even unloaded. The town, once noisy with trade and salt wind, falls still. People whisper of a curse. In Genoa, bodies are buried in the soft earth outside the gates. One grave, then 10, then hundreds. In Venice, the city of canals, masks, and marble. The council gathers by candlelight. They order ships to wait 40 days offshore, a word we still use today, quarantine. 40 giorni, 40 days. But even the sea cannot hold back the sickness forever. The rats swim, the fleas leap, and the breathless, coughing sailors still walk ashore. Beyond the cities, the plague travels along old Roman roads. Wagon wheels turn slowly. Shoes leave muddy prints behind. From town to town, it rides in the hay of merchant carts, in the cloth of traders, in the breath of pilgrims. A group of traveling singers, once joyful, vanish after one performance. A village priest watches his parish disappear one family at a time. A baker keeps his oven burning, though no one comes for bread. In fields once golden with wheat, crows perch on the fence posts. No hands remain to harvest. The earth lies still. Let us visit one small village, somewhere in the heart of France. A village like hundreds of others, nameless now, forgotten by time. But for a moment, let it return to us. The village is made of stone and timber. Thatched roofs lean beneath the weight of spring rain. A tiny stream winds along its edge. The people here, simple folk, till the earth, raise pigs, tend to chickens. There's a small church with a worn bell, a mill by the stream, a healer named Jean, who knows the roots and herbs of the forest. She is one of the first to notice. A child with a fever that will not break. A man with dark swellings beneath his arms. A dog refusing to go near the house. She tries everything she knows. Mint and yarrow, boiled bark and honey. Prayers whispered at dusk. But the child dies, and the man after him. and the dog disappears into the woods. Jean leaves a mark on their door, a small charcoal X. She begins to walk alone. In the larger towns, a new figure appears, cloaked in black, gloved, masked, and still, a silhouette like death itself. His beaked mask is stuffed with lavender, myrrh, and rose petals, not for protection, but to block the smell of decay. These are the plague doctors, hired not to cure, but to record, to count the dead, to witness. He walks from house to house, writing notes in a leather-bound book. No one speaks to him. No one follows him. When he enters a home, he rarely returns to it again. Children watch him from behind shutters. Their mothers pull them close. He is a man of medicine and myth. In one entry, he writes, 6 souls today. The smallest, no larger than my arm. The father wept. The mother did not. In the beginning, the church bells rang for every soul. 1 toll for a man, 2 for a woman, 3 for a child. But now, they ring no more. There are too many. Gravediggers cannot keep up. Bodies lie in carts, waiting for burial. Some are thrown into mass graves. No names, no prayers. The priests try to hold services. They burn incense. They sing psalms through cracked lips. But even the holy fall. One by one, churches fall silent. The candles go out. Only wind and mourning remain. And when fear grows too large for reason, people look for someone to blame. Rumors begin to spread that the sickness comes from poisoned wells, from bad air, from strangers. The Jewish communities of Europe are among the first accused. In some towns, they are driven out. In others, burned. We now know the truth. The plague did not come from people. It came from nature, from chance, from something unseen. But in those days, the line between fear and cruelty was thin. Let us return now to the village. A woman sits by a bedside. Her child breathes in shallow gasps. She has done all she can. Washed his face with cool water. Held his hand through the fever. Prayed by his side for nights on end. She whispers to him stories of stars and birds, of spring flowers and dreams. But he does not respond. When the sun rises, he is still. She does not cry. She carries him to the stream, washes his little hands, wraps him in clean cloth, and buries him beneath the old tree where they once played. She places a stone and walks home alone. But even in the darkest days, some light remains. A monk in an abbey copies old texts by candlelight, refusing to stop his work even as the brothers around him fall. A midwife tends to a woman in labor and helps deliver a baby who breathes strong and sure. A group of villagers, all who remain, gather in the church not for prayer, but to share bread, stories, and warmth. And in the fields, the grass begins to grow again. The world has not ended. It has changed. And in time, it will begin again. Close your eyes now, dear listener. Feel how quiet the world has become. Not out of fear, but peace. You are far from danger, far from sorrow. You are simply drifting through time, through story, through soft, ancient silence. And in that silence, the world continues to turn. You're still here, traveler, drifting gently beneath your blanket. Your breath slow, your eyes heavy. The fire still crackles softly in the distance. The stone hall still shelters you. Outside, the night is cool and endless. And as the shadows of our story deepen, so too does the silence of the world we've wandered into. Tonight, we step into the aftermath, the echo that followed the roar, the years when the plague returned again and again. But when something new began to stir beneath the sorrow, let us return to that fragile world, The first great wave of plague passed through Europe like a storm. But unlike a storm, it did not truly end. The Black Death returned, again in 1361, then in 1369, and again every decade or so for centuries. Some called it the pestilence, others the Great Mortality, but all knew its signs. This second wave took those who had been children during the first. Young adults now, barely grown, with no memory of life without fear. It came in spring or fall, with no pattern, no reason. Towns that had begun to rebuild, emptied again. Graves dug shallow, filled too quickly, but the people were no longer surprised. They did not scream. They did not cry. They waited, and they endured. In cities across Europe, a strange sound echoed through the streets. Whips, chanting, footsteps in rhythm. A procession of barefoot men, robed in white or red, their backs bleeding from self-inflicted lashes. They sang hymns and prayers. They wept aloud, and they begged forgiveness from the heavens. They were the flagellants, religious wanderers who believed the plague was a punishment from God. They believed suffering would cleanse the world. They walked from town to town, gathering crowds, spreading fear, and sometimes the disease itself. The church watched them with unease, and in time, banned them. But for a while, they were everywhere, wandering ghosts, crying out for mercy in a world gone silent. As the years wore on, the plague became something more than a sickness. It became a presence. People dreamed of it, wrote about it, drew it. In paintings, it was shown as a skeleton with a scythe, dancing through crowds. In poems, it was a cold lover who kissed you in the night. In songs, it was a whisper in the wind, or a shadow behind the door. Children drew little skulls on scraps of parchment. Adults spoke of death as if it were a neighbor. And in the distance, bells continued to toll. From this time, only a few voices remain. One of them, a merchant from Florence, left behind a letter, a quiet note to a friend, written after months of loss. It reads, "I write to you, not as I was, but as I am now. There are only 10 of us left in the city. I walk each day through the streets, past empty stalls, past homes where no light burns. I do not know what I live for, but I live. And each morning that I wake, I choose to remember the names of all who did not. We do not know what became of him, but his words remain, floating across time, like petals on a stream. Slowly, after many winters, a change began to appear. Where once the streets were empty, now came the sound of carts again. Where bells had rung for mourning, they began ringing for weddings. Children, born after the plague, knew no other world. To them, silence was normal, but they began to fill it with noise again. Farmers tilled soil left untouched for years. Priests reopened the old churches, and in the cities, painters picked up their brushes again. In the years that followed the plague, a new kind of art began to appear. Walls and altars were covered with strange images, not of saints or angels, but of death itself. One of the most famous was called the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death. It showed people of every class, kings, peasants, nuns, soldiers, holding hands with skeletons, smiling, dancing. It was not meant to frighten. It was meant to say, death comes for all, so live fully while you can. One plague doctor, unknown by name, left behind a final journal entry, written in Latin, simple, quiet. It said, "The pestis is not finished, but I am. My work here has been to see, to listen, to write. And in doing so, I have known more of life than I thought possible. Some believe he died soon after, Others think he simply took off the mask and became one of the many. Let us walk now to the edge of an old forest, a place left untouched for many years, where trees stand tall, moss thickens, and birds sing once more. Here, a young girl gathers herbs in silence. Her mother once taught her the uses of each leaf, each flower. She remembers now. She bends to pick a sprig of thyme, breathes it in. The wind carries the scent, and with it, something else. Hope. By the early 1400s, Europe was changed. The population had shrunk by more than half. Whole villages were gone. But those who remained carried something with them, a strange mix of sorrow and resilience. They had known the worst, and yet they endured. It would be many centuries before the world understood the truth of the plague, the bacteria, the rats, the fleas. But the people of that time left behind something deeper, a reminder that even in darkness, there are songs to be sung, candles to be lit, and stories to be told. Rest now, traveler. Let your eyes grow heavier. Let the long roads of history soften beneath your feet. The plague, terrible as it was, passed, but memory remains. And tonight, you have listened. You have walked beside the dead and the living. You have watched the bells fall silent and rise again. You are safe now. You are still. And the world, once again, turns gently beneath the stars. You're still with me, wandering soul, drifting in that soft, half-waking world, where shadows grow long and time begins to blur. The fire still glows softly. Stone walls gently hum with the memory of long-ago voices, and the story we've been following is not quite over yet. Tonight, we travel beyond the height of the Black Death, beyond the cries, the silence, the sorrow. Tonight, we step into what came after. A world that did not end, but one that would never be the same. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip on Europe, it left behind more than empty homes and mass graves. It left behind a different world. Imagine it now, a continent quieter than it has ever been. Villages half empty, fields overgrown, workshops silent. Even the birds seem to sing less often, but slowly, surely, things begin to move again, not as they were, but as they must be. A blacksmith takes up his hammer once more. A child is born in a cottage where 3 had died. A monk lights a candle and begins to write again. Before the plague, most people in Europe were peasants, bound to the land, bound to the will of lords, bound to a rhythm that had not changed for centuries. They worked for bread, for permission, for survival. But after the plague, there were fewer people, fewer hands to sew, fewer backs to bend, and suddenly, labor was precious. Peasants began to ask for more freedom, more wages, more say. In some places, they were granted it. In others, they were punished for asking. Rebellion sparked, quiet ones, loud ones, rising like smoke from the ashes of the old world. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 shook the ruling class. In France, rural uprisings known as the Jacquerie flared. And though these rebellions were put down, the idea of change had been born. It would not be forgotten. The nobles, too, felt the change. Their halls, once crowded with servants and guests, were emptier. Their wealth, once measured in how many people they ruled, was thinner. And with each passing year, more titles passed to new hands. Families ended. Old bloodlines vanished. Some noble houses tried to rebuild by force. Others turned inward, locking their gates, clinging to ceremony. But the old balance had shifted. No one knew it yet, but the feudal system, that rigid ladder of medieval life, was beginning to crack. And all across Europe, new ideas began to take root. The Black Death shook even the most sacred things. The church, once seen as the guiding hand of God, was deeply wounded by the plague. Priests had died in great numbers. Monks fell in silence in their abbeys. Holy relics offered no protection. Prayers had not stopped the dying. Some people clung to faith more tightly than ever. Others began to doubt. Why had God allowed such suffering? Had the church failed in its duty? Was holiness powerless? A quiet wave of questioning began to ripple through the land. And in time, those questions would grow louder. They would lead, centuries later, to movements like the Reformation. But their roots were here, in these candlelit nights of doubt and searching. Because of the massive loss of life, there were vacancies everywhere. In villages, in trades, in leadership. Where once a man had to follow his father's path, now there was room to choose. A peasant's son might become a merchant. A stonemason's daughter might learn to read and keep accounts. Opportunity, born of tragedy, was everywhere. Women who had lost husbands, sons, and fathers began to take on roles once closed to them, managing farms, selling goods, even running inns or shops. It was not a revolution, not yet, but it was a shift, one of many, quietly reshaping society. From the ashes of plague, a strange and beautiful thing began to grow. People began to think differently, not just about work or faith, but about life. Art, once dominated by religious themes, began to turn toward the human. Painters started to explore faces, bodies, emotions. Writers, inspired by ancient Greek and Roman texts, began to ask bold questions. What does it mean to be alive? What is beauty? What is truth? This rebirth of thought, this flowering of art and science, we now call the Renaissance. And though it is often linked with names like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Galileo, its spark, its earliest whisper, came from the silence left behind by the plague. In Florence, a man named Giovanni Boccaccio wrote a book during the Black Death. He called it the Decameron. It told of 10 young people who fled the city to escape the plague and passed the time by telling each other stories, tales of love, trickery, courage, and joy. It was one of the first great works of modern literature. It reminded people that laughter could still exist, even in times of loss. Elsewhere, chroniclers recorded the deaths, but also the dreams. A woman in Avignon wrote of visions she saw after the plague. A monk in Germany composed music so haunting, it felt like a prayer for the world. The grief was not forgotten, but it was reshaped, made into song, story, memory. In the decades after the plague, a new figure began to appear in rural towns. A wise woman or cunning man, someone who knew herbs, who listened carefully, who carried no cross, but brought comfort. They were not priests, not doctors, but they were trusted. These folk healers became important in communities still fearful of sickness. They offered dried rosemary for protection, lavender for sleep, elderberry for fever, and more than anything, they offered time, presence. Many would later be labeled as witches, but in this time, they were needed. In cities like London, Paris, and Cologne, whole streets were abandoned after the plague, but not forever. Slowly, newcomers arrived. They cleaned the soot from the hearth, swept out dust, lit new fires. Some buildings were never reclaimed. They crumbled, and where they fell, gardens grew. Nature had crept back into cities. Vines on stone, foxes in courtyards, owls nesting in chimneys. The line between the human and the wild had blurred, if only for a while. By the mid-1400s, the children born after the worst waves of the plague had grown into adults. They had never known the old world, only stories of it, spoken softly around hearth fires. They did not fear death the way their parents had. They were bold, curious. They sought out knowledge. They invented. They painted skies with colors not seen before. And their children would go on to sail oceans, to build cathedrals, to challenge kings. The world was no longer quiet. It had begun to sing again. Though the Black Death never truly vanished, returning in waves for centuries, its first, most terrible blow had passed. Some say it took 75 million lives, others say more. But what it gave in its terrible wake was a world reborn, a loosening of old chains, a widening of the mind, a humbler view of life and death, and the seeds of a renaissance that would light all of Europe. And all of this began in silence. Rest now, traveler. Let your mind drift now. You have walked through shadows. Listen to quiet bells tolling in the night. Watch the world fall and rise again. And now, you rest. You are not in the past. You are not in the noise of the modern world. You are here, in the stillness between moments, where stories gently fade into dreams. Let your breath grow deeper. Let the stone walls fade. Let the fire burn low. You are safe. You are still. And the world, as always, turns. The fire has not gone out yet. It still flickers gently in the hearth beside you, casting golden light along these old stone walls. Soft shadows dance in rhythm with your breath, and the quiet hum of night settles all around. You're still here, drifting in this deep current of time, half waking, half dreaming. And I'm still with you, still telling this story, a story older than memory, but somehow still alive in the world. Last time we were together, the Black Death had finally begun to fade. The bells had grown quiet. The cities had begun to stir again. And out of the silence, something new had begun to bloom. Now, the years have crept forward. The century turns. The air is still heavy with memory, but the world is changing. In the streets of Florence, painters climb ladders and brush color into ceilings. In quiet rooms in Venice, men and women read ancient texts by candlelight. In Nuremberg and Bruges, new machines spin and stamp, carve, and press. Ideas move faster. Thoughts stretch farther. Something is waking up. No one calls it the Renaissance just yet. That name will come later. But the people feel it. They feel it in their bones and in their dreams. A longing to understand, to see, to build, to shape, to remember, and also to imagine. The survivors of the plague, and their children, and their children's children, they do not forget what was lost, but they no longer live only in shadow. Now they begin to turn toward the light. And it begins, strangely, not with grand kings or battles, but with curiosity. A single man walks along a dusty path beside a stream. In his hand is a notebook. In his mind, questions. He watches the way a bird moves its wings. He wonders how muscles work. He sketches the curve of a petal, then the cross-section of a skull. He does not know it yet, but his name will echo through time. Leonardo, Da Vinci. In his notebooks, we find the fingerprints of wonder, the slow, careful reaching out of a mind unafraid of mystery. Others begin to do the same. They map the stars, chart the human body. They read ancient Greek and Latin and Hebrew. And then they write their own words, new words, for a new world. Printers begin to appear, their shops filled with the scent of ink and hot metal. Before long, Pages that once took a year to copy by hand can now be made in an afternoon. Books, once precious enough to be chained to tables, begin to travel. And with them, ideas. A merchant in Lisbon reads a poem from Florence. A monk in Krakow studies a map from Venice. A girl in Ghent hears a story written in faraway Constantinople. The world becomes smaller and richer. Art changes too. It had once lived in churches, icons and altarpieces, golden and distant. Now, it begins to step down from the walls and look the viewer in the eye. A young woman's portrait, her gaze soft, her smile barely there. A scene of friends at a table, sharing bread and wine. A body, not idealized, but real. Flesh and shadow, flawed and human. This shift, this tenderness, it is something new, but it is born, in part, from all that had been lost. Because when you've seen the world end, you see the world differently when it begins again. There is beauty in the everyday, sacredness in simple moments, and in the face of death, life becomes holy. Not just the life promised after death, but the life here. Now, a child, laughing in a courtyard, the scent of fresh bread in the morning, a sunbeam falling through stained glass. Painters tried to capture it, poets tried to name it, and quietly, a new philosophy began to emerge. Humanism. It did not deny God, but it honored the human experience. It saw value in each life, not just kings or saints, but merchants, mothers, carpenters, children, every soul, a universe. The Black Death had reminded the world of how fragile that universe could be. And now, people began to cherish it all the more. But not all was serene. As new ideas rose, so too did fear. There were some who worried that curiosity would lead to pride, that seeking knowledge might open forbidden doors, that questioning tradition could unravel the order of the world, and in time, there would be conflict. Thinkers condemned, books burned, lines drawn between the old and the new, but not yet, not tonight. Tonight, we sit in the hush of the early Renaissance, as if watching a garden bloom at dusk. The air is still, but alive. Somewhere, in a workshop, a boy grinds pigment into powder. He dreams of painting the sky. In a small town, a girl hears a new kind of song, one with harmony, not just chant. She hums it under her breath, not knowing she is part of a revolution. In a monastery, a monk leans over a candle, copying a scroll from 1,000 years ago. He does not know that others, in far-off cities, are beginning to question what he copies, to debate it, to expand it. The world is still full of uncertainty. Plague still lingers. Wars flare and fade. Not all is peaceful, but change moves like a river. And those born after the silence carry within them a strange mix of grief and hunger. They remember the emptiness, but they are not afraid to fill it. New buildings rise, not just castles and cathedrals, but libraries, hospitals, schools. The language of medicine begins to shift. It is still crude, still limited. But there are whispers now of things like circulation, of infection, of anatomy beyond superstition, a new way of seeing the body. Not as a vessel of sin, but as a wonder in itself. And beyond the cities, beyond the scholars, ordinary people live these changes in small, quiet ways. A farmer teaches his daughter to read. A midwife shares remedies passed down from mother to daughter, but now she also adds herbs from a book she was given by a traveling friar. A shoemaker crafts a pair of boots for a young man heading to a university that did not exist 30 years earlier. These are not famous names. They do not appear in the history books, but they are part of the story. They are the roots beneath the visible tree, the quiet breath behind the voices that shape the world. And all of it, the questions, the inventions, the paintings, the poems, the pain, the joy, all of it comes from what came before, from the long, dark night of the plague, from the silence that followed, and from the stubborn, radiant hope that emerged afterward. Hope that said, we are still here. We can still wonder, still create, still love, still learn. The plague had tried to end the world, but instead, it lit the match for a new beginning. Now the fire has burned low. The coals glow gently. You have listened well, wandered long. This part of the journey is nearly over, but the story continues. The Renaissance will rise. New lands will be found. New questions will shake old answers. The world will grow and break and grow again. But not tonight. Tonight, there is only the soft crackle of firelight, the breath of sleep at your side, and a story settling gently in your bones. The past is not gone. It lingers in us. It whispers in the quiet. And as you close your eyes, somewhere far away, a new candle is being lit, a new page turned, a new voice, ready to tell the tale again. Rest now. You are safe. You are here. And the story will wait for you. When you wake again, the candlelight still flickers softly near your shoulder. You're resting deeply now. The world beyond your blanket long forgotten. But in this space, between waking and dreaming, the story continues to breathe. It's been many years since the Black Death loosened its grip on Europe. The century has turned. A new generation walks the narrow streets of Florence and Bruges, of London and Prague and Seville, their feet on cobblestones that once rang with the wheels of death carts, but now echo with music, trade, learning, and the soft murmur of change. The Renaissance has not yet peaked. Its light is still dawning. But it has grown stronger with each passing season. Now there are new tools in the hands of the curious. A printing press turning rhythmically in a corner shop. A lens, ground carefully by hand, used to peer into the heavens. A brush, dipped in pigment, made from crushed stone and ash. A compass, spinning quietly on a table beside a map of a world still full of blank spaces. And there are still masks, too. Not the long, beaked masks of the plague doctors. Those are fading into memory, strange relics of a darker time. But newer masks, symbolic ones, masks of status, masks of power, and beneath them, the same human faces, searching, doubting, hoping, pretending. Though the plague itself has waned, its ghost remains. In the minds of artists and thinkers, in the ways cities are planned and hospitals are built, in the prayers spoken by candlelight and the ink-stained letters sent across borders. People remember. Even the ones born after it still grow up with its presence. Grandmothers still tell stories of those empty days. Church windows still bear the colors painted in gratitude by survivors. Folk songs still echo the sorrow of the dead. And deep down, there's a quiet fear that it might one day return. But alongside that fear, something else grows stronger. A desire to understand. The old explanations, demons, bad air, divine punishment, no longer feel quite as solid. More and more, minds begin to seek new answers. Scholars pore over ancient Greek medical texts. They debate Galen and Hippocrates. They sketch the body, cut open cadavers in secret, measure the distance between muscle and bone. They begin to ask questions that might once have been called heresy. What is sickness? Where does it come from? Why does it spread? And though they don't yet know of bacteria, of viruses, of cells, They are inching closer, step by step, thought by thought. Still, not everyone approves. The old guard, powerful clerics, cautious nobles, look upon these changes with unease. To question too much is to risk unraveling the delicate thread that holds society together. Because if people begin to doubt how illness works, what else might they question? The church, the crown, the order of the world. And in time, those questions do come. In Wittenberg, a monk named Martin begins to murmur. He sees corruption, excess, indulgence. He puts his thoughts to paper, 95 of them, nails them to a door. The sound of that hammer echoes farther than anyone expects. Another kind of plague spreads, not of the body, but of division. Protestants, Catholics, wars of faith and identity. And through it all, the memory of the Black Death lingers, a reminder of how fragile society can be, how quickly certainty can be swallowed by chaos. Across the sea, other eyes begin to turn outward, westward. Ships leave the harbors of Portugal and Spain, carrying sailors, explorers, and the hungry dreams of monarchs. They chart unfamiliar waters. They find new lands, or so they believe. But these lands are not empty. They are already full of life, story, song, language. Still, the age of exploration begins. Maps change shape, trade routes shift. And in the wake of these voyages, disease travels too. The plague that once devastated Europe now finds new shores to haunt. In the Americas, whole nations fall to fevers they have never known. In cities like Tenochtitlan, once vibrant and vast, the population collapses in silence, victims not of swords, but of germs. And so the legacy of the Black Death becomes entwined with other plagues, colonial, cultural, biological. One age dies, another is born. The world grows ever more complicated. In the growing cities of Europe, ideas continue to build upon one another. A man named Copernicus dares to say the Earth is not the center. A man named Galileo dares to agree. Others draw machines that can fly, design cathedrals that reach toward heaven, compose music that carries sorrow like a lullaby. And always, beneath the stone and parchment, beneath the lace collars and gold-trimmed manuscripts, the question remains, how did we survive? What did the plague take from us? And what did it leave behind? For some, it left fear. A fear passed on like a shadow at the edge of the hearth. A fear that whispers, even in moments of joy, remember how quickly it can all vanish. But for others, it left resolve. A determination to learn, to record, to heal, to imagine a world that would not crumble so easily the next time death came knocking. And so, quietly, in places large and small, people begin to prepare. They establish councils of health, build quarantine ports, write manuals of hygiene. Some of it is flawed. Much of it is still rooted in old misunderstandings. But slowly, the groundwork is being laid. The foundation for a future where disease is met not just with prayer, but with knowledge. And now, as we near the end of this part of our story, you may begin to feel it too. The echo of all that came before, and the promise of what lies ahead. The fire has burned low. Outside the stone walls, the night hums softly. Perhaps there is a gentle rain, or the hush of wind through trees. The world you know, full of cities and science, vaccines and satellites, is still shaped by that distant cry of the plague cart, the weeping of mourners, the brushstroke of a painter who saw death and still chose to paint life. You have traveled far tonight, from the depths of plague-ridden alleys to the heights of new ideas. And yet, history is never finished. It waits, always, just around the corner. It speaks, even now, in your quiet moments. Close your eyes Breathe deeply. And know that even in darkness, humanity has always sought the light. The fire hasn't gone out yet. Its warm, flickering glow still touches the stone walls around you, casting long, soft shadows. Shadows that stretch through time. Outside, the world is hushed. The streets are quiet, the skies dim. Perhaps the stars are out above, or perhaps they're veiled behind a thick, wandering mist. But in this space, safe, calm, and warm, the story continues. You may have thought the plague had ended, that it came, once, terrible and vast, and then passed like a storm in the night. But that was only the first chapter. The truth is, it came back, again and again, in waves, in whispers, in screams. And each time, it reminded the world that the past had not yet let go. Let's drift now to the year 1665, a hot, restless summer in the city of London. The streets are dense with life. Tradesmen, merchants, children playing marbles in the alleys. The plague had not visited in many years. Generations had grown up without it. But that year, in the sweltering heat, the rats returned. So did the fleas. And quietly, the sickness began to spread. At first, it was just a whisper. A few deaths in the poorer districts. Doctors, still in those strange bird-like masks, began making visits. A red X was painted on the doors of infected houses, accompanied by the ominous words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Inside those homes, entire families waited, trapped by law, sealed off from the world. Food was left at their doors. No one entered. No one left. Still, the sickness moved. By July, hundreds were dying each week. By August, it was thousands. And the people fled. The rich packed their things and escaped to the countryside, just as they had centuries before. The court of King Charles II abandoned the city. The streets of London grew eerily quiet. Shops were shuttered. Church bells rang endlessly. Bonfires were lit in the hopes of purifying the air. Bodies were collected at night, thrown into great pits outside the city walls. Men called searchers of the dead walked the alleys, lanterns in hand, faces hidden, marking the places where silence had fallen. There were rules now, more than before. Watchmen were stationed outside infected homes. People were forbidden to gather. Public plays, dances, even funerals were banned. But still, it came. The Great Plague of London claimed nearly 100,000 lives in just 1 year. A quarter of the city's population, gone. And then, as suddenly as it arrived, it faded. No one quite understood why. Perhaps the coming cold killed the fleas. Perhaps the fire, yes, the Great Fire of London in 1666, which consumed vast parts of the city, helped drive the last embers of plague into ash. And just like that, it was over. Again. But it was not just London. Years before, the plague had burned through Venice, that beautiful floating city of canals and masks. In 1630, nearly a third of its people perished. There, the quarantine laws were strict. Ships arriving from distant ports were held for 40 days, a practice that gave us the very word quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days. Special islands, lazarettos, were used to isolate the sick. Monasteries and empty palaces turned into makeshift hospitals. Yet still, the disease found its way in, and in the midst of that sorrow, art was born. Painters like Titian and Tintoretto, men who may have seen the plague with their own eyes, filled canvases with images of martyrdom, suffering, and transcendence. Churches built in thanksgiving after the plague still rise above the waters of Venice today. Silent solemn witnesses to all that was endured. Elsewhere, too, the plague returned. In Marseille, in 1720, brought by a merchant ship from the eastern Mediterranean, a single vessel, carrying silks, spices, and something unseen. Despite warnings, the ship was allowed to dock, and within weeks, the city was in chaos. Guards were posted along plague walls, stone barriers built to stop the disease from spreading. But the sickness did not respect walls. It crept through forests and fields, and it devoured lives by the thousands. It would be the last major outbreak of plague in Western Europe. After Marseille, the disease began to retreat. Not entirely gone, but quieter now. The world was changing. Medical knowledge, still slow and full of missteps, had begun to shift. The idea of contagion, that illness could be passed from one person to another, was no longer dismissed. New methods of sanitation began to take root. Sewer systems were redesigned. Streets were cleaned more regularly. Doctors began to use observations, not just theory. But it would still be centuries before the truth was known. Still, no one yet understood the tiny creatures behind it all. The Yersinia pestis bacterium, carried by fleas, carried by rats. That secret would remain hidden until the 19th century. And even then, the world had one more shadow to face. Because the plague did not disappear entirely. Far from it. In the late 1800s, in the crowded harbor cities of China, another outbreak began. It would travel by steamship to India, to Africa, even back to San Francisco. Historians now call it the third pandemic. Less known, less talked about, but deadly all the same. This time, though, things were different. Now there were microscopes. Now there were scientists. Now the enemy could be seen. And so the plague, once a mysterious curse from God, became a bacterium with a name, a pattern, a life cycle. It didn't make it less frightening, but it made it known. And what is known can be studied, prepared for, fought. The old masks were set aside. The long beaks filled with herbs no longer seem useful. In their place, clean gloves, boiling water, quarantine protocols based on evidence. The world had finally learned, not perfectly, not without pain, but it had learned. And tonight, as you lie there, listening to the wind of centuries drift past, you may feel it. That long arc of understanding, from fear to fact, from shadow to light, and perhaps to a quiet reverence for all those who lived and died in those centuries of fire and fever. Their names may be forgotten, but their stories echo still, in the silent walls of old cities, in the shape of our hospitals, in the way we respond to fear, in the way we seek the truth. The candle is low now. Your breath is soft. Let the past wrap around you like a gentle mist. You have traveled far again, and the journey is not over yet. But for now, rest. The candlelight wavers, but it has not gone out. The fire is smaller now, not roaring, not bold, but steady, warm, present. You lie still, wrapped in quiet, and the air is thick with memory. We've walked together through centuries, from the first great wave that shook Europe in the 1300s, to the trembling silence of empty cities, to the flickering return of the plague, in London, in Venice, in Marseille. And now, the story carries us forward again, not far in time, just a few hundred years. But it feels like another world entirely, because something had begun to change. The world was growing faster. Ships no longer creaked across oceans for months at a time. They steamed across waters in days or weeks. their tall smokestacks trailing black clouds. Cities grew larger. Trains roared through mountains. Telegraphs carried messages through wires of copper and glass. Empires stretched across continents. People from opposite ends of the world met in markets, in ports, in factories. The age of industry had begun, and with it, a new chapter in the story of plague. It began, once again, in the east, in the southern province of Yunnan, China. Around 1855, reports began to emerge of a strange and deadly sickness. It moved slowly at first, through rural villages, through winding rivers, along the backs of animals and the boots of soldiers. But eventually, it reached the ports, and from the ports, the world. By the 1890s, the plague had taken hold of Hong Kong, a vibrant, crowded harbor city bustling with trade. There, in the sweltering heat, it moved quickly through neighborhoods packed with life. The dead began to rise in number. Fear once more settled thick over the streets. But this time, something was different. This time, there were scientists watching. Among them was a man named Alexandre Yersin, a quiet, determined bacteriologist from France. He had come to Hong Kong in 1894, not with incense and prayer, but with a microscope. While the world around him trembled in panic, Yersin worked calmly in a makeshift lab, studying the tissues of the dead, examining samples drawn from the infected. And in time, he saw it. Tiny, rod-shaped, alive. A bacterium, invisible to the naked eye, yet capable of bringing empires to their knees. He named it Yersinia pestis. After centuries of guessing, miasmas, curses, divine punishment, the truth was finally known. The plague was a living thing, and it had a pattern. It traveled from rat to flea, flea to human, human to human. The masks, the bloodletting, the bonfires of old, none of them had stopped it, because no one had seen the real cause, not until now. Yersin's discovery changed everything. Suddenly, there was a path forward, a way to fight back, not with fear, but with knowledge. But even as the truth was found, the plague still moved. From Hong Kong, it spread across Asia, to India, where cities like Bombay saw thousands perish, to Africa, carried by ships and soldiers, to the Americas, where even San Francisco would feel its touch. The third pandemic, as historians would later call it, lasted for over half a century. In that time, more than 12 million people died, most of them in India and China. Governments responded in ways both bold and brutal. Whole neighborhoods were burned. Suspected plague victims were forcibly removed from their homes. Quarantine laws returned, stricter than ever. And yet, the knowledge spread too, across laboratories and lecture halls, through medical journals and quiet revolutions of thought. Vaccines were developed, protocols refined, maps drawn, showing how the plague moved, who it touched, and how it could be stopped. And for the first time in history, humanity began to understand disease, not as mystery, but as mechanism. It didn't bring immediate peace, but it brought clarity. And clarity, in time, brings power. Still, there were those who did not believe. In some places, scientific understanding clashed with old customs. Fear led to riots, to resistance, to mistrust of the very people trying to help. The world was learning. But slowly, even in San Francisco, a city of modern buildings and electric lights, the arrival of plague caused panic and silence. In the early 1900s, when a case was discovered in Chinatown, officials tried to cover it up. Commerce mattered more than truth. But the disease would not be ignored. In time, word spread. And the same debates that had echoed through the streets of 14th century Florence now echoed in America. Who was responsible? What was safe? Who should be blamed? And always, beneath it all, that same silent question: will it happen again? Eventually, with better sanitation and public health efforts, the outbreak slowed. Quarantine stations were built. Fleas and rats were studied, hunted, controlled. And the plague faded. Not gone, but understood. It would never vanish entirely. Even today, Yersinia pestis lives on, in the soil of the American Southwest, in the wild rodents of Central Asia. But now it is watched. Now we know its name, its shape, its path. And knowledge, quiet, careful knowledge, has replaced superstition. You might imagine Yersin in his small lab, years ago, bent over a slide of glass and light, discovering something that would change the course of human history. Not with drama, not with swords or speeches, but with stillness, with quiet, with truth. And in the soft candlelight of your room tonight, you may feel it too. That sense that something vast can be known, understood, faced, even the plague. The fire is low now. The pages of this chapter nearly turned, but the story continues. There is still more to explore, not just what the plague was, but what it left behind, in culture, in memory, in us. So rest your eyes, slow your breath, and let the past guide you gently into the next part of the journey. The fire has burned low now, not gone, but quiet, like the hush that settles after a storm. You're still here, wrapped in calm, half in this world, half in another. And tonight, the story changes again. The plague is no longer roaring through cities, no longer filling mass graves, no longer knocking at the door, but its echo remains, not just in bones and old records, but in the soft corners of culture, in stories told to children, in nursery rhymes whispered at dusk, in the uneasy shape of certain rituals, and the words we still say without knowing where they came from. The Black Death was not only an event, it became memory, and memory, over time, takes strange forms. In some places, there were whispers of ghost towns, villages where every soul had perished, left to the wind and ivy. In others, there were stories of wandering spirits, plague victims who had died suddenly, whose burials had been rushed or forgotten, and whose rest was not yet complete. Old folk songs sometimes hinted at the plague without naming it. Verses about dark winds, about shoes left at the door, about children who never grew up. And then there was a rhyme, one you may know. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Today, it's a playground chant, sung in circles, with laughter. But some believe it holds the echo of older grief. Ring around the rosy, the reddish rash that marked the skin of the sick. A pocket full of posies, flowers carried to ward off the terrible smell of death. Ashes, ashes, the burning of the bodies, and we all fall down. The ending, no one escaped. Of course, scholars debate the origins. Some say it came later, that it's only a coincidence. But even coincidence has power when stories linger for centuries. The truth is, the plague left a scar, not only on cities and maps, but on the collective soul. In churches, new rituals emerged. Candles lit not for celebration, but for protection. Priests who once blessed marriages now blessed masks and fumigated rooms. Weddings became quieter, funerals more frequent. Whole generations grew up surrounded by mourning, and over time, that mourning shaped language itself. Words like quarantine, from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days, came into being because ships were once held offshore for 40 nights just to be safe. The word plague became more than a disease. It became a symbol of misfortune, of chaos, of fear that could not be named. Even clothing changed. In regions touched by repeated outbreaks, people dressed differently. Longer sleeves, covered mouths, a subtle reflection of an invisible fear. Art, too, remembered. There were woodcuts of the danse macabre, the dance of death, where skeletons led people of all classes into the afterlife, holding hands with kings and peasants alike. It wasn't meant to be cruel, only true. The plague had made one thing terribly clear: death spared no one. And so, people carved it into their churches, painted it on their walls, sang it in their hymns. Not out of despair, but out of understanding. This, too, was part of life. Even centuries later, echoes remain. In the winding streets of old European towns, you may still find plague crosses carved into stone, marking where the sick once lay. In some cathedrals, entire chapels are dedicated to saints believed to protect against the plague, like Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows, or Saint Roch, who nursed the dying and was said to have survived the illness himself. And in the deep countryside, certain wells, trees, or stones were remembered not for what they were, but for the stories people told around them. This is where the plague cart came. This is where the last child in the village was buried. This tree, it never grew again after the sickness passed. Whether true or not, such stories carry memory, and memory never dies all at once. Sometimes, the fear became tradition. In parts of Eastern Europe, doors were painted with tar to mark infected homes. The symbol faded, but the practice of marking misfortune continued in ways subtle and strange. In certain villages, masks were still worn in festivals, long after the need for them was gone, not to hide from disease, but to honor the past, to remember without remembering. And across cultures, the idea of the unseen danger grew stronger. In folklore, these dangers took many shapes: demons, spirits, bad winds. But at their heart, they echoed the plague, an invisible force that came in silence, that could not be reasoned with. Even fairy tales grew darker. Forests became places of trial. Strangers were often feared, and safety was something fragile, easily lost. But perhaps the greatest legacy of all was the way people clung to light. In the face of such darkness, they sang more. They told stories. They wrote letters, kept journals, planted flowers in graveyards, as if to say, yes, we suffered, but we are still here. And even in your room now, safe and quiet, you are touched by that legacy. The lullabies, the words you use, the quiet hush that settles at bedtime, when stories are told, not for entertainment, but for comfort. It is the same instinct that made people gather in candlelight centuries ago, whispering tales to make sense of the world. And so, the Black Death became not just a chapter in history, it became a ghost in the library, a shadow in the hallway, a breath on the back of the neck. Not frightening, just present. A reminder that we are fragile, that life is precious, and that even the darkest nights can be remembered gently, with soft words and slow stories. So as the wind stirs outside your window and the fire flickers low, you may feel those echoes too, not as fear, but as stillness. The kind of stillness that only comes after a storm has passed. The page turns again soon, But for now, let memory rest. Let your breath be slow. And let the old world fade gently into dreams. The air tonight feels older somehow. Not heavy, but full. Full of thoughts left unspoken. Of hands once held. Of moments that slipped away long ago, but left something behind. You are still. The room is warm. The story continues. For all its grief, the Black Death did something strange to the world. It left a silence. And from that silence, something began to grow. In the centuries that followed, the memory of the plague did not just haunt. It taught. Slowly, quietly. In the corners of sick rooms, in the records of monastic scribes, in the gentle instructions passed from elder to apprentice, a new kind of understanding was born. Medicine, as we know it, was still centuries away. But its seeds had already taken root. Long before hospitals as we imagine them, there were monasteries, quiet stone buildings, tucked into forests or perched on hillsides, where monks prayed, studied, and cared for the sick. They kept gardens of herbs, lavender, rosemary, yarrow, wormwood, not just for cooking, but for healing. They washed wounds with vinegar, boiled water before giving it to the dying. They observed symptoms and recorded patterns, even if they didn't understand them. When the Black Death came, many of these monks stayed behind while others fled. They believed it was their duty to comfort the dying, to offer last rites, to bear witness. Many fell ill themselves, but those who survived carried knowledge forward. Over time, their notes became manuals, their routines became practices, and their humble herb gardens became the blueprint for something larger. In medieval cities, plague hospitals were built, crude by today's standards, but focused, spaces set aside for isolation, for care, for something like healing. They were often managed not by physicians, but by barber surgeons, craftsmen who cut hair, pulled teeth, and, when needed, lanced boils and stitched wounds. Their tools were simple: blades, cloth, hot iron, but they watched closely. They noticed who lived, who didn't, what helped, what hurt. And in that long process of trial and error, medicine evolved, not in leaps, but in tiny steps. Sometimes, in the quiet of your own thoughts, you might imagine those ancient tools: a metal bowl of hot water, a length of linen, the slow, careful touch of someone trying to ease a fever. There were no machines, no beeping monitors. Just breathe. Skin. Stillness. Eventually, as the worst of the plague passed, thinkers began to ask new questions. What caused disease? If not sin, then what? Some believed in imbalances of the humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Others studied astrology, the position of the stars and planets, looking for patterns in the heavens that might explain why one village lived and another fell. But underneath all the theories, something quiet and profound was happening. People began to observe. They started to collect data, to compare outbreaks, to ask, where did it start? How did it move? In Italy, England, and the Islamic world, scholars wrote long texts on contagion, air, water, and touch. One doctor wrote, "When one man sickens, and another near him also sickens, there must be something shared between them, though we cannot yet see it." That something shared was still a mystery, but the idea of transmission had taken root. And once a question takes root, answers begin to grow. Some cities, like Venice, took bold steps. They established the first quarantine stations, places outside the city where travelers and ships were made to wait, sometimes for weeks, before being allowed to enter. It was imperfect, but it worked. plague cases dropped, and other cities soon followed. In time, public health was born. Not just the care of one person, but the health of many. The idea that disease was not just personal, it was shared, collective, that it could be managed, not with fear, but with structure. And structure began to form. Doctors wore colored robes to signal their presence. Some cities had boards of health, early versions of what we now call health departments. Laws were written to manage burial, to control waste, to limit movement during outbreaks. And though many of these efforts were rough, they revealed something important. The world was learning, not just how to treat disease, but how to live through it. By the 17th and 18th centuries, this quiet learning had gathered strength. Hospitals were better built. Wards were divided by illness. Ventilation was studied. Infection began to be seen not as fate, but as something that could be interrupted. And always, behind the progress, was the memory of the Black Death. The stories of carts in the streets, the images of masks and bells, the silence of cities. That memory whispered, "Be ready." And so people prepared. In Britain, detailed death records were kept. Not just numbers, but names, ages, causes. Maps were drawn, showing how disease spread. And with every outbreak, the response grew more refined. By the 19th century, science had caught up with instinct. Bacteria were seen under microscopes. Vaccines were developed. Medical schools taught germ theory, sanitation, and anatomy. Hospitals became clean, bright places of care, no longer feared, but trusted. And yet, in some small way, that medieval world still lingers. In every mask worn during flu season, in every hospital protocol, in every gentle hand placed on a fevered brow. The journey from superstition to science was long, uneven, marked by suffering, but it was real, and it never would have begun without the darkness that forced the world to see. So now, as your room grows quieter and the fire fades into gentle embers, you may find comfort in the thought that even the worst chapters of history can lead to something better. That behind every mask, every sterile hallway, every modern cure, there is a story, and that story includes you. Still here, still listening, still dreaming. The night deepens now, but the story continues. There is more to tell, not just of how we healed, but of how we remembered. The world you dreamed of last night may not be the same one you wake to now. In our story, the Black Death has passed its peak, but the land it leaves behind is changed. Changed in ways that few could have imagined. The cities have grown quieter, not with silence, but with space. Empty homes, overgrown fields, dust settling where voices used to be. But this emptiness, as heavy as it feels, becomes a kind of doorway. In it, new lives begin. Tonight, in the stillness of your room, let's drift gently through those changes. Slowly, softly, as if walking across frost-covered earth at dawn, where every step reveals something once hidden. In the centuries before the plague, the world was rigid. Kings ruled by divine right. Landowners held power. Peasants were bound to the soil. Serfs, unable to leave, working for lords in return for protection and permission to live. There was little room to move, little chance to rise. You were born into a place and stayed there. But then, the plague came. It swept through the manor halls and the peasant huts alike. No title could shield you. No wealth could guarantee survival. And when the sickness finally faded, the old world had cracked. The population had been cut by a third, in some places, even more. And with so many gone, an odd and quiet power shifted hands. Labor became scarce. And for the first time in memory, the poorest people were needed. The lords needed their fields harvested. The merchants needed goods moved. The towns needed hands to build, to clean, to work. But the workers, they were no longer voiceless. They had options. A young man might leave the village and offer his skills elsewhere for better pay. A woman might sell goods at a market instead of working in the fields. A servant might become a tenant, a landowner. Change happened slowly, like morning light creeping over distant hills. But it came. In England, entire villages vanished, not just from the plague, but from people leaving in search of better lives. Abandoned cottages sank into the earth. Hearths grew cold. But in the towns and cities, new homes were built. Markets expanded. Craft guilds flourished. And with that came tension. The powerful, those who had always ruled, felt their grip slipping. They passed laws to stop laborers from demanding more, set wage caps, punished those who tried to move. But it was like trying to hold back the tide. Once people tasted freedom, even just a little, they did not forget. In 1381, a quiet rumble turned to thunder. The peasants' revolt broke out in England, led not by nobles, but by farm workers and artisans, men who had watched their families die, who had labored through plague and grief, and who now asked, why must we still bow? They marched on London, demanding fair wages, lower taxes, an end to the old bondage. And though the revolt was crushed, its echo lingered. Other uprisings followed across Europe, not in fury, but in awakening. The idea had taken root. That power could shift, that the world did not have to stay as it was. Even the towns began to look different. Walls were repaired. New houses built not just by nobles, but by tradespeople who had learned how to shape stone and timber. Children were born into these rebuilding years, into quieter, humbler lives, yes, but also into a world with new space. Fewer mouths meant more land, more food, more opportunity. In the countryside, wild animals returned. Forests regrew. And in some places, old Roman roads, long forgotten, were cleared again, connecting isolated hamlets. Trade found new routes. Markets once seasonal became permanent. Money, not just land, became a measure of wealth. A slow march toward what we now call a middle class had begun. And with all this came another change, one harder to see, but no less powerful. Time itself felt different. Before the plague, the rhythm of life was almost timeless. Seasons repeated. Generations worked the same land. Life felt like a wheel, always turning, but never moving forward. But now, people began to think in futures. They imagined better lives, saved money, taught their children to read. Not everyone, of course. Much suffering remained, and poverty did not vanish. But the wheel had cracked, and something new crept through. And so, the Black Death, so often remembered for its death toll, must also be remembered for what it left behind. A world that was, in some small ways, freer. Not because people sought change, but because the world had broken so deeply that it could not return to what it had been. And maybe, in that, there is a quiet comfort. That from loss came motion, from grief, possibility, and from the deepest night, the first traces of a different dawn. Now, listen to the quiet again. Can you hear it? Not the sound of chaos, but of rebuilding. A cartwheel rolling slowly over earth. A hammer tapping at a new roof. A pen scratching across parchment as someone signs a contract. No longer a serf, but a tenant, with rights and choices of their own. This is how the world changes. Not all at once, but in slow, soft shifts, like breath. Tonight, may you rest in the knowledge that even the darkest chapters carry the seeds of renewal, and that the people of that time, just like you, found ways to carry on, to grow, to rebuild, to hope. So let your breath slow, let the fire fade to quiet coals, and let the old world drift softly into dreams. The night is still. Candles flicker low, and outside, if you listen closely, you might almost hear the turning of a page, not just in our story, but in the human spirit itself. Tonight, we linger in the years after the Black Death, not in the chaos and grief we've come to know, but in the slow stirring of thought, of color, of creation. When the sickness had passed and the cities grew quiet, many people looked inward. They sat with their sorrow. They turned to faith, or to questions too large for words. And slowly, sometimes alone in their rooms, sometimes gathered near fires, they began to make things. Images, stories, songs. Not to forget what had happened, but to make sense of it. To give shape to something that had, until then, been too vast to hold. Across Europe, art began to change. Before the plague, paintings in churches were often full of gold leaf and holy calm, scenes of saints, distant and serene. But now, new images appeared. They showed suffering, decay, skeletons dancing across village squares, the pale hand of death reaching into the lives of kings and peasants alike. It was called the Dance of Death, a strange, chilling motif that appeared in murals, carvings, manuscripts. It showed that death came for everyone, young and old, rich and poor, noble and common. But it also carried a strange kind of comfort, because if death came for all, then perhaps none were truly alone. There was a kind of equality in it, a recognition. Artists did not flinch from pain. They painted sorrow as it was, raw, unfiltered. But in doing so, they allowed others to see their own grief mirrored, and maybe feel understood. Writers, too, began to speak in new tones. In Italy, one man, a young notary's son, named Giovanni Boccaccio, lived through the worst of the plague in Florence. He wrote a book called The Decameron, a collection of stories told by 10 young people who had fled the dying city to stay in the countryside. Each day, they shared tales, some tragic, some romantic, some playful and light. And beneath the stories was a quiet message that even in the darkest times, laughter, love, and storytelling could survive. It was not a grand history. It was not scripture, but it was real. Boccaccio gave voice to the everyday, and in doing so, captured something sacred. Others followed. Poems were written not in Latin, but in the language of the people: French, English, German, Italian. Voices once considered unworthy of literature, women, servants, merchants, began to appear in stories, their joys, their fears, their questions. Some poems whispered of lost lovers, others cried out in anger, asking why God had allowed so much death. Some found comfort in faith, others found none, but they wrote anyway, not to solve the mystery of suffering, but simply to speak into it. And in doing so, they made space for healing. In the north, artists turned to woodcuts, simple images carved into blocks, printed again and again. They showed not only the plague itself, but its aftermath: doctors with beaked masks, grave diggers at work, monks praying at bedsides. There was sadness in these images, but also resilience, a kind of witness. And perhaps that's what art became in those years. Not just decoration, but a kind of remembering, a way to hold on to what mattered, even when so much had been lost. Even music changed. Chants became darker, more contemplative. Some songs, passed from village to village, spoke of death, not with fear, but with tenderness. A lullaby for the end of life, a hymn for those who remained. And always, there was the image of the candle, the small flickering light in the dark, a symbol, not of grandeur or triumph, but of presence, of quiet survival. Even in churches, the sermons changed. Priests spoke not only of sin, but of compassion, of the need to care for one another. They reminded people that God had not abandoned them, that in every hand offered, every act of kindness, something holy endured. In time, all of this, the paintings, the songs, the writings, wove together into something larger. A slow, painful awakening. People began to see the world differently. They looked more closely at the human body, at the stars, at nature. They studied, they measured, they questioned. And from those questions, a new age would one day rise, what we now call the Renaissance. But even then, in its earliest, quietest moments, it began not with brilliance, but with grief, and with the simple, steady work of human hands trying to understand a world that had changed forever. As your own breath slows and the night settles around you, you might imagine one of those hands, dipping a brush in paint, carving a single line into wood, lighting a candle before beginning to write. In a world still full of sorrow, these were acts of hope, software gentle, real, and maybe, in your own quiet way, you are part of that same tradition, listening, imagining, remembering. As long as stories are told, the past is never lost. And as long as someone listens, the light, however small, continues to glow. So close your eyes now. Let the colors of the past drift gently around you, not in fear, not in darkness, but in peace. And know you are part of something vast and beautiful and very, very old. Sleep well, wandering soul. The story will be here when you return. The candle is low again. The fire has settled into quiet coals. And outside, the night is vast and still. Tonight, we drift further into the world left behind by the plague that changed everything. Not the world of panic and plague carts, but the world that came after. Slower, quieter, full of questions no one had asked before. After the Black Death passed, many people looked up, toward the heavens, toward God, toward whatever might make sense of all that had happened. But the answers were not always clear. Some clung to faith more tightly than ever. Churches filled with the sound of prayers, of weeping, of quiet promises made in the candlelight. Others felt something crack inside. They had prayed, they had given, they had obeyed, and still, their families had died. In some places, belief grew stronger. In others, it slipped away. People did not abandon their faith all at once, but they began to question the old certainties. Why had so many innocents perished? Why had some of the holiest men fallen, while thieves and drunkards had survived? Why had no priest, no king, no relic or holy procession been able to stop the death? And in that quiet, after the storm, new thoughts began to take shape. Thoughts that asked, what if the world is not just a stage for the divine, but something we are meant to study and understand? Scholars began to look not just to scripture, but to the world itself, to the human body, to herbs and weather, to the strange patterns of illness and recovery. It wasn't science yet, not as we know it. But it was the beginning, a gentle turning of the mind toward observation instead of just tradition. Doctors, long guided by ancient texts, began to write their own. They recorded symptoms, drew diagrams, and asked new questions. Some looked to the stars, others to the soil, still others to the winds. And slowly, the idea grew. That knowledge could come not only from the past, but from the present. From looking, listening, noticing. It was not a revolution, but a quiet awakening. And at the center of it all was nature. The plague had shown how small humankind could be, how a single flea, a single breath, could topple cities. People saw the earth differently now, not just as a backdrop for their lives, but as something powerful, unpredictable, alive. Some feared it, others tried to understand it. Herbalists cataloged plants, midwives shared knowledge passed from mother to daughter. Monks wrote books about seasons, animals, the stars, and the world, once thought to be fixed and unmoving, began to feel dynamic, mysterious, alive with forces no one yet understood. This wasn't the end of faith. Not at all. Many still turned to prayer, to the comfort of ritual, to the warm hush of a chapel in the cold. But alongside belief grew curiosity, and in time, that curiosity would lead to great change. But for now, in these years just after the plague, it was tender, tentative, like a child waking from a long, uneasy sleep and asking, what happened while I was dreaming? People looked at animals differently too. Cats had once been feared in some places, linked wrongly with superstition. But now, their absence during the plague was remembered. And in many villages, cats were welcomed again, guardians of the home, watchers in the dark. Rats, once unnoticed, became symbols of illness. Not because people understood the science, but because the memory of their presence during the plague lingered. Stories spread, some true, some not, about what had caused the Black Death. And slowly, people began to separate illness from punishment, to imagine that maybe sickness was not always sent from above, but rose from the earth itself. That maybe, if they studied it, they could learn how to stop it. And so they did. They began to keep records, lists of symptoms, patterns of spread. They mapped who had fallen ill and where. This quiet work, done in dim rooms by scholars and scribes, often unnoticed, was the early breath of science. And yet, even as this new thinking emerged, many people still turned to older comforts. They made charms, carried sprigs of rosemary or lavender, wrote prayers, and folded them into lockets. Not because they were foolish, but because they were human. And the need for comfort never fades. In many towns, old stories returned, tales of spirits in the forest, of omens in the sky, of healing springs and wise women who knew the ways of the moon. The plague had taken so much, and where logic could not reach, story stepped in. But perhaps the greatest shift of all was something quieter still. People began to cherish the present. Before the plague, life had often been seen as preparation for heaven, for judgment, for eternity. But now there was a new attention to this life, this hour, this breath. Songs were written about the fleeting nature of time. Poets spoke of love, not in abstract, but in the warmth of a shared meal, a hand held in winter, a kiss beneath trees that had outlived the dead. Pain had made people tender, fragile, and deeply alive. They didn't always speak of it that way, but it showed in what they built, what they wrote, what they passed on, and it whispers still. Even now, centuries later, you can feel it, in the way a painting makes you pause, in the way a poem settles in your chest, in the quiet knowledge that life is short and still worth loving. That, too, is the legacy of the Black Death. Not just sorrow, but clarity. Not just ruin, but reflection. And so, as you close your eyes, know this. The people of that time, your distant kin, walked through darkness and found meaning on the other side. They made mistakes. They stumbled. But they also listened and learned and carried what mattered forward so that you, here now, could lie beneath a quiet sky and listen to their story and sleep. 14. Time has passed. Not just minutes or years, but centuries. And tonight, as the fire burns low and shadows settle softly on the walls, we look back once more, not on the chaos of the plague itself, but on what remained after memory began to blur. In the decades after the Black Death, life slowly returned, not to what it had been. That world was gone, but to something new, different, strange, yet familiar. Children were born who had never seen the plague. They grew up hearing only whispers, tales told by grandparents at dusk, fragments half remembered. A black sickness, a wind that killed, masks shaped like birds, bells ringing through empty streets. It all seemed distant, unreal. And yet, the world they lived in still bore the marks. In towns across Europe, stone buildings stood abandoned, churchyards overflowed, and in small corners of stained glass windows, you could sometimes find odd little images. A skeleton dancing, a doctor in a beaked mask, a figure kneeling beside a shallow grave. Not every viewer knew what they meant, but some did. Old eyes, grown quiet with time, might linger there and remember. The Black Death had been a rupture, a tear in the fabric of life, and though the wound had scarred over, its shape remained. You could see it in the way towns were rebuilt. Narrow alleys widened, waterways cleaned, windows added to let in more light. You could feel it in the laws that changed. Rules about hygiene, about burial, about how to care for the sick and poor. In some places, city archives began for the first time. Records kept, cases documented, because now people knew what could happen, how quickly it could come. In others, the memory took stranger forms. Festivals arose, mock pageants of death and rebirth, parades with skeleton masks, songs sung in the voice of the plague itself, not always out of fear, sometimes out of defiance, as if to say, "We remember you, and we are still here." But memory is a tricky thing. It shifts, it forgets, and over time, the sharpness of the Black Death softened. Many of the gravestones were lost to moss. Many of the names disappeared from parish records. Stories passed from voice to voice, grew dim. By the time a new wave of plague returned, generations later, many had forgotten what the first had truly been, and so they suffered again. That is one of the oldest patterns in history, a great sorrow, a generation of silence, and then a return. But even if the details faded, something deeper remained, a quiet knowledge, passed not in words, but in feeling, that life is fragile, that things can change, that what feels solid today can vanish by morning. And yet, people lived. They worked and married and watched the stars. They sang lullabies to children in languages born after the plague. They sowed wheat in fields where bones once lay. They dreamed, and that too is memory. Not just what we recall, but what we carry. A tenderness, a caution, a deep, unspoken love for the time we are given. If you visit the old towns now, places where the plague once walked, you won't always find monuments. Many made no statues, no plaques. But if you walk quietly, you might notice the little things. A chapel with an oddly wide door, made to let in plague carts, a fountain that once served as the only clean water source, a dusty corner in a museum where a dark painting hangs, its figures strange and solemn. And if you close your eyes, you might feel it. Not fear, not sadness, but presence. The sense that others were here before you, that they suffered, yes, but also endured, and passed something on. The Black Death did not just end lives, it changed how we live. It taught people to look at their cities, their neighbors, their world, with new eyes, to plan for tomorrow, to forgive more easily, to listen for the quiet signs of change. It didn't teach these lessons quickly, but over time, like water wearing down stone, the memory of it shaped the future, and it continues to. Even now, when you pause for breath, when you hold someone close, when you wonder what truly matters, you are touching something ancient, something passed down through centuries of silence and song. As you lie here, wrapped in blankets, safe from the cold, your breath soft and steady, you might imagine a room, far away, hundreds of years ago. A person much like you, watching the candle burn low, wondering what the future might bring. They could never know you. And yet, here you are, part of the same long story, carrying the same quiet light forward. So let the memory settle, not as fear, not as sadness, but as a kind of wisdom, something gentle and very old. Close your eyes now. Let the past drift into dreams. The world is still turning, and you are part of its song. Sleep well, dear listener. The fire has nearly gone out now. The candle is a pool of soft wax, and the night is deeper than before. Outside, the wind has quieted. Only the occasional creak of old wood or the distant sound of an owl reminds you that time is still moving. And here, in this stillness, we come to the final part of this story. The story of a sickness, yes, but also of what came after. Because no great sorrow ever truly ends. It lingers, in stone, in song, in the way people speak softly when they remember. And yet, it also fades, softens, transforms. In the generations after the Black Death, people continued to rebuild. Not with fanfare or great declarations, but slowly, quietly. The way forests grow back after fire. The way laughter returns to a house after mourning. There were new fields planted where there had once been graves. New walls built with stones that had witnessed the worst. And though the memory of the plague remained, it did not always take the form of fear. Sometimes it showed up as kindness, as caution, as care. People began to treat each other differently. They had seen how quickly life could vanish, how fragile the human body was, how easily cities could be silenced. And so they cherished things more. The warmth of bread, the shape of a child's face in lamplight, the smell of clean sheets, the sound of birds after long silence. These became sacred too. There is something about surviving that changes the way you see the world. You notice the small things. You linger in moments that others pass by. And even if you don't speak of it, you carry that stillness with you. In some towns, whole generations grew up without ever knowing what the plague had been. They played in streets that had once been emptied by death. They drank from wells dug in desperate years, and though they didn't know it, they were living inside the resilience of those who had come before. In monasteries and libraries, old records remained. Letters, journals, scribbled accounts of plague years, written in shaky hands, sometimes with tear-stained ink. Many of these documents sat untouched for centuries, but they were kept, preserved, because someone believed they mattered, because memory, Even silent memory wants to be held. And so the stories were passed on, not always directly, not always clearly, but in the way people built their homes, in the way doctors studied the body, in the way city leaders prepared for sickness with the quiet urgency of someone who had heard whispers from long ago. In time, new plagues came, some smaller, some vast, and each time, humanity remembered, not always in words, but in instincts, how to care for the sick, how to create distance, how to comfort without touch. These lessons, first learned in terror, became part of who we are. The old paintings remained too, in churches and cathedrals, in private homes. Strange, solemn figures, skulls woven into crowns, dancing skeletons holding hands with kings and peasants alike, not out of morbidity, but out of recognition that death walks with us, and so does life. In the centuries that followed, people found ways to live fully without forgetting what had been lost. They wrote poems. They planted trees. They sang lullabies that echoed with longing. And through it all, the world kept turning. New discoveries were made. Art blossomed. Science was born from observation. Compassion grew out of grief. The legacy of the Black Death was not only tragedy, it was also clarity, a reminder of what matters, of how brief and beautiful life can be. Even now, as you listen in this quiet moment, eyes heavy, body still, you are part of that legacy, a thread in the great woven fabric of endurance and renewal. The story didn't end in the 1300s. It continues in every act of care, in every community that watches out for its own, in every scientist who asks how we can prevent suffering, in every artist who gives voice to pain and wonder, and in every person, just like you, who takes a moment to reflect, to be still, to listen, to remember. Even if the memory is not yours directly, you carry it. You are the descendant of survivors, of people who faced darkness and kept walking, who mourned and rebuilt, who wept beside fresh graves and still found a way to laugh again. You may never know their names, but their strength lives in you. And tonight, as you rest, you honor them, not with grand words, but with quiet, with presence, with being here, with letting your breath slow, letting your thoughts soften, letting the noise of the modern world fall away. Outside, the world continues. Cars, phones, cities full of lights. But here, you've returned to something older, to candlelight and stillness, to the gentle hush of firelight stories, to the heartbeat of history, steady and slow. And as we bring this story to a close, know that it doesn't truly end, because the past is not behind us. It's within us. The Black Death was not just a chapter of suffering. It was also a turning point, a mirror held up to humanity. And though it brought great loss, it also revealed great resilience. That is the gift of remembering, not to dwell, but to see clearly, to live more fully. So tonight, let your body rest. Let your thoughts wander. You are safe. You are part of a great and ancient story. The candle has burned low. The fire has cooled. And outside, the stars are turning. Sleep now, dear listener. Sleep deeply and dream well.